Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And I'd like to welcome you to another of our series of Conservationists in Action. And this afternoon we're very fortunate to have Katie Fallon join us. Thank you, Katie, for coming out. Katie is an author and conservationist. Her most recent book is called Cerulean Blues, A Personal Search for a Vanishing Songbird, in addition to teaching at WVU, if I'm not mistaken, and writing a book. She also is one of the founders of the Avian Conservation Center of Appalachia, Inc., a nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving wild birds through scientific research, outreach, and public education. So it seems like you're a perfect fit for a Fish and Wildlife Service facility, and we're really excited to have you here. Katie's going to be speaking to the Potomac Valley Audubon Society later tonight, but we were fortunate enough to sneak her into the studio to talk about her book. So welcome, Katie.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Now, you wear a lot of hats. You've published in quite a few interesting literary journals and so on. Tell us a little about your background.
I started out my college career actually in the wildlife sciences at Penn State University.
Okay.
And then when I failed chemistry.
The bane of many biologists,
yes.
myself included.
I always enjoyed writing also, and I thought I could still contribute to conservation through writing. I didn't necessarily have to be a trained wildlife biologist, so I pursued creative writing, and I went to graduate school for creative writing at West Virginia University. Taught for several years at Virginia Tech, and now I'm back at West Virginia University teaching creative writing again.
Well, right. Welcome back to wild and wonderful West Virginia.
Thank you.
How did you pick this particular bird to write about?
Well, it's, of course, the most beautiful bird that we have, right. Here in the U.S.
I think so.
Yeah. When I was in graduate school, I went to a presentation given by Petra Wood, who's a biologist who studies cerulean warblers. And after her presentation, I thought, that's a really fascinating story. This bird, its numbers are declining so steeply. It's such a beautiful bird, and this region is so important for the species overall. I thought, somebody should write a book about that. Right. But I was in graduate school at the time. I didn't think it would be me. Right. Then in 2006, I was teaching at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, and I read a very short article that the cerulean had been denied threatened status by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I thought, wow, how is a bird not threatened? So I just started to do more research. And I thought, well, no one's written a book yet, so maybe it should be me. So I interviewed a lot of biologists. I had the opportunity to go in the field and do some banding and some observation with some PhD students and others who were studying the cerulean. And I also got to go to Colombia, South America, to see ceruleans where they spend the winter. And I had really an amazing time with doing all the research for the book.
It shows in the book. It's actually beautifully written, and it's kind of Carson-esque.
Oh, thanks.
You also had a mixed background in writing and life sciences, and it's fascinating.
Thank you.
It opens up in an interesting way for a bird book with your experiences at Virginia Tech. Why did you choose to start the book that way?
Right when I started to do the research for the book is spring of 2007. And of course, that's when we had the horrible shooting at Virginia Tech, where 32 students and faculty were killed, 33 if you count the shooter. And that was in mid-April, I almost didn't do any of the book. I almost just decided I should sit in my room and cry and watch news reports, which is not healthy. No. My husband kind of said, you have all these interviews scheduled, you have all this great research going on, go out, you better go out and do it, you didn't die. So I very reluctantly and slowly just kind of carried on, and the first few trips out with some of the biologists in the field were a little rough. They were only, I think, 3 weeks after the shooting, and it was challenging to be able to go out and think about something other than how sad I was. Right. I wasn't sure if I was going to include that in the book or not. The first version of the book had actually more sad than the published version, and then I took it all out and my agent sent it to the publisher without any Virginia Tech shooting in it at all. And then over dinner one night, after the book had already been accepted, I mentioned to the publisher, oh yeah, I had this Virginia Tech chapter that I pulled, and he said, why don't you show it to me?
That's a good publisher.
Yeah, so I did, and he said, I think that this is really important, so we put it back in the book.
Did you know any of the students that were shot?
I did. I had one of my favorite students ever was shot and killed. She was just 18 years old and was a wonderful, very smart student, always smiling. Great. Are you trying to make me cry here?
No, no, no. In fact, we're going to get off this right away.
Okay. She was an excellent student, though, and you know, it's a shame that happened. She was a beautiful student.
It added a poignancy to the book, though, and a human element that's really nice that carries through it. And once again, the title is Cerulean Blues. Katie Fallon is the author, and it really is a personal journey, discovering quite a bit about this bird and sharing it with the reader. Now, I'm a historian, so I have to ask, how was the bird discovered and named? Which I feel safe asking you because it's in your book.
I don't know I'm not sure if I know how it was named.
Probably
Uh-oh.
because it's blue.
Because it's blue is what I assume.
And where is the blue? It doesn't look like a blue jay for those that haven't had the pleasure of seeing it.
No, it doesn't look like a blue jay. And it doesn't really look like a bluebird either. Yeah. And the bird is much smaller than a blue jay, and even smaller than a bluebird. The bird only weighs about 9 or 10 grams, which is the weight of 2 nickels. It's a very small bird. The blue is on its back and its wings, on the back of its tail, but we very rarely would see the blue because the bird stays in the canopy. So if you're out bird watching, you'll get the famous injury known as warbler neck, trying to look up at the cerulean warbler. Most often we see its belly, which is white, and it has a little blue-black necklace, the male, and that's sort of the definitive feature of a cerulean warbler. When you're on the ground looking up, you see a white belly with a necklace, you can say, cerulean.
Did early birders identify this? Audubon or some of these guys?
Well, Audubon identified ceruleans in the Mississippi River Valley, and his description was not really accurate of where they like to nest. His picture of a cerulean warbler that he has, I use as one of the chapter openings, they're in a kind of tree where they might not normally be found. He did not mention ceruleans living in the Appalachians, which of course is where most of their population lives today. About 80% of the cerulean population breeds in central Appalachia from southwest Pennsylvania through all of West Virginia, East Tennessee, East Kentucky. He didn't really identify them there, and no one's really sure if he wasn't looking or if they kind of moved to this region when the large, matured, old-growth forests in the river valleys were cleared.
That's interesting. Tell us a little about its natural history. You said it's very little, it's very light. What are some other interesting? It is beautiful. I mean, there's a wonderful picture of it on the front of this book where you can see the blue on its head much easier than you can in the wild. But what else is? Well,
it's a beautiful, again, very small bird. 9 grams, again, is very small. Each little wing is only 2.5 inches long. They are one of our later returning migrants. You might not see a cerulean until late April around this part of West Virginia. Maybe even some years a little bit later. First week of May, you're pretty safe to see a cerulean.
Okay.
And then they're leaving fairly early, August. But while they're here, they're eating a lot of caterpillars, leafhoppers, spiders, little insects and spiders that you would find around the undersides of leaves. They tend to nest at least 30 feet, or an average of 30 feet in a tree, very high, often on a horizontal branch. Their nest is very small, made of grapevine bark, some lichens, and some spider webs. They usually attach the nest to the branch with spider webs, which is pretty amazing.
For being so high up, that doesn't seem that stable.
I know, it doesn't. Right. And it's really amazing that these birds, they're long-distance migrants. They go a greater distance than some of our other migrants. They go all the way to the northern Andes of South America,
Right.
where some of our migrants, stop in Central America. Some might stop in Texas.
Right.
But the Ceruleans just keep on, go all the way to the northern Andes. Most biologists agree they're a trans-Gulf migrant, and they fly across the Gulf of Mexico during fall migration and hurricane season. It's really amazing that any of these birds make it back at all.
Yeah. So when did you see your first cerulean?
I saw my first cerulean when I was researching this book, which is a little
That's
embarrassing.
amazing.
I know. Well, there are a lot of people, good birders, who don't see ceruleans. It's not just me.
So tell us about your first experience. It makes a nice chapter.
Okay. Well, one of
And I wasn't sure that was your first time.
It was.
Yeah.
That was my first cerulean. I went out birding with one of my good friends, Hiller Klandorf, who teaches in the Animal and Vet Science Department at West Virginia University. He's officially a poultry physiologist, but secretly, he's a professional birder.
Okay.
I mean, he is very active in local Audubon groups, and he does a lot of birding. He's been known to jump out of moving vehicles to see birds and trespass.
Sounds like a dangerous guide.
Yes, yes. Well, Hiller and I went birding at Cooper's Rock State Forest just outside of Morgantown on a trail called the Raven Rock Trail, which ends at a beautiful overlook. It's less than 4 miles round trip, and it's a fairly reliable spot to see ceruleans. So Hiller and one of Hiller's students and myself went out on the Raven Rock Trail one morning in early May of 2007, and Hiller heard a cerulean singing and took off running through the woods, and I happily kept up with him. And he said, the bird is in this tree, and I looked up and saw the bird with its necklace. And I often try to make other warblers into cerulean warblers, like the black and white warbler, black-throated blue warbler, sort of have some similarities with the cerulean, but once you see that necklace, you can be confident that's what you have.
Does it have a very distinct song, the cerulean?
Its song is buzzy and ascending. It's been described as a zer 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 zee, or just a little sneeze. One of the biologists who studies ceruleans thinks that they sound like they're saying tiff 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 Tiffany. That's her name. So
It's appropriate for approaching Mother's Day.
yes.
You mentioned West Virginia has a large population of
Yes.
ceruleans. Do we have the largest of any
Well,
state?
it's debatable.
Okay.
I think we do have the largest population. I've read that we might have a third of all breeding ceruleans, which is a good chunk of them. There are some places in East Tennessee that might kind of argue a little bit with West Virginia, that they might think they have more, but we have a lot of them in West Virginia. And you can see them at some places in the northern panhandle, some places here in this part of the state in the eastern panhandle, and then southern West Virginia. So there are places all throughout the state where you can see them. They're very thick in southern West Virginia around the New River Gorge.
Okay.
You can see a lot of ceruleans there.
It raises a question. I mean, because it's such a hard bird to identify and see, are we confident with the counts we have of ceruleans?
Probably not. I've read that estimates, total population estimates, from 300,000 to 500,000, which is quite a large.
Yeah, that's quite a spread.
That's quite a spread. So it's they're difficult to see. I mean, they're very small and they stay high in the trees. So if you're not really good at finding ceruleans, it can be difficult to count them.
How are they doing in West Virginia?
Well, it's as far as I know, right now they seem to be absent from some places where they used to be. There are some places in the northern panhandle, I guess, where they used to be more abundant than they are now. Lewis Wetzel Wildlife Management Area is one. I talk about that in the book, and I visited that a few times. I have heard that they are not as common there as they were just a few years ago when I researched the book. But I just got back from a birding festival around Fayetteville, and it certainly seemed like they were doing fine there. But as they lose habitat, or habitat changes,
Right.
we would certainly lose ceruleans. If they don't have a spot to nest and make more ceruleans, their populations will decrease.
One of the more shocking chapters in your book was the impact of mountaintop removal on the Ceruleans. Talk a little about that.
Well, mountaintop removal coal mining, which of course is controversial here in West Virginia,
Right.
and elsewhere too. But some of my friends from other states see pictures of mountaintop removal coal mining in West Virginia and say, "How do you let that happen?"
Right.
And it can have a devastating effect on a lot of species, not just ceruleans. But ceruleans are generally considered an interior forest species. They don't like edges. Right. They don't like big edges. Like a road or a trail, those kind of edges, they don't mind, and they might even prefer to be around a small edge like a road or a trail. But a huge edge, like that which is created by a mountaintop removal coal mine, is too big for ceruleans. They want to avoid that edge. So that coal mining not only removes their habitat outright, but it degrades habitat around it. And one thing that is important to ceruleans, at least in Appalachia, is ridges. So ceruleans seem to prefer to nest on ridges where there are hardwood forests, mature to old growth hardwood forests. If you remove an entire ridge, you're changing the whole topography of the land. I mean, you're not giving the ceruleans the kind of elevation that they like in this part of the country, and you can't really put the mountain back. Even if you find a way to reforest it, and there are some groups working on reforesting former strip mines, you still don't have the elevation that ceruleans in this part of the country like.
No, it was kind of striking. One of the things I hadn't heard before in your book was how they actually, because of what you said with the edge communities, even the intact forest on the edge of these strip mines, they're not there anymore. They're pushed even further.
Pushed even further. Or if they are there, they're at risk for more predators or nest parasites like the brown-headed cowbird.
Mm-hmm.
Brown-headed cowbirds like forest edges. They like fields. So if you have a large edge like a strip mine, you might be inviting cowbirds into your nest.
Can they fit a cowbird egg into it?
Oh yes, they do. Yeah, they can.
It's a larger egg. I'm surprised.
yeah, I'm surprised too. But the cowbird will often push out the other eggs and take all the food for itself.
How fast are they declining, the ceruleans?
Their numbers have declined about 3% a year since 1966, and that was when they first started counting. So that's about an 80% decline since then. It is huge.
Talk a little, you mentioned at the beginning, and we're interested, talk a little about the attempts to get it listed under the Endangered Species Act.
Well, there was a petition filed, 2000 or 2001, mm-hmm. I believe, to list it as threatened. The Southern Environmental Law Center and I think 26 other groups petitioned to have it listed as threatened. The first round of, it made the first cut. I forget the technical term for it, but it made the first cut as it might be warranted, yep. I guess, for listing.
For further investigation then, right?
Yeah. And then it made it through several cuts, I guess, until finally it was decided that even though their numbers have been declining very steeply, and even though they were suffering habitat loss here in their breeding range, there were still too many cerulean warblers to be in danger of becoming endangered in the foreseeable future.
So it has no protection yet.
Just the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which protects all of our migratory species.
Where else did you go to study the bird besides West Virginia, where you're living now?
Well, West Virginia. I also went to Tennessee. Sort of the West Virginia part of the book. That was when the biologists were doing a lot of nest observation, a lot of banding. A similar study was going on in Tennessee, but I went down there a little later in the summer, early July, so I could see some baby ceruleans. Mm-hmm. And I did get to see one, which was pretty exciting. But I was a little bit late and the rest of them all fledged. But I did get to see one baby, so I was happy. And then I also got to travel to South America, to Colombia, to see ceruleans where they spend the winter. The one part of, I missed going to the stopover habitat in Central America. You really only get 2 weeks or so in the summer or the spring and 2 weeks in the fall to do that migration research, and it always seemed to fall at the beginning or end of a semester, right. And I never quite got there, but maybe one day. But going to Colombia was really a really wonderful experience. Before, I had the book mostly written without the Colombia part, and I mentioned to my agent that there was a Cerulean Warbler Summit going to happen in Bogota, and he said, well, you have to go. And I said, Colombia is a little bit scary.
It is.
And he said, Dad, you have to go. That's even better for the book if it's scary. So
Add some dramatic tension.
yes, so I was very scared to go to Colombia. I'd only been to Canada before and Aruba, both sort of like the U.S.
Relatively
a little
safe.
bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
relatively safe. But nothing even remotely bad happened the whole time I was there. The people were wonderful. The birds were amazing. Colombia has more bird species than any country on the planet. They sort of argue, I think, with Brazil, but
But that's a good argument to
it's
have.
a good argument. They have over 1,800 bird species,
Wow.
and the U.S. has something like 700.
625 is the number we throw out.
625. Okay.
But it's quibbling.
Yeah, I remember in the big year when they went to Atu and all
Yeah,
that. It was
right. You can get more.
You can get more. Yeah. So 1,800 bird species
Yeah.
would be quite a big year. That's a lot of birds. And really, if you like warblers, tanagers, hummingbirds, I mean, Colombia has over 100 hummingbirds.
Wow.
I know I missed a lot of species that I've never seen before and might not see again because I was overwhelmed by the number of birds. There is actually a Cerulean Warbler Reserve outside the town of San Vicente de Chucurí in the Santander department, northeastern Colombia, on the way to Venezuela, but not all the way. It's a 550-acre reserve. 50 acres is coffee plantation that they're trying to convert to shade grown, and 500 acres is Colombian oak forest, and it's absolutely gorgeous. There are facilities there where you can go and stay. There's a garden with a lot of plants and nectar feeders and fruit feeders, and we saw cerulean in the garden. It was really a wonderful place. I highly recommend Colombia.
What does the habitat for ceruleans look like in Colombia? Because it's hard for us to get our mind around. Well, we know what an Appalachian forest looks like. Where are they in the Andes? Where are they in the?
The Andes in Colombia are a little smaller than the Andes that at least I've pictured. When I picture the Andes, I think of
Incas and Peru.
yeah, or I think of snow caps.
Yeah.
I think of that Alive where the plane crashed and they ate each other. I think of that's when I picture the Andes. I think of snow and very steep. And these Andes were smaller. They weren't as big as those in Chile and Argentina. And the forest where they live actually reminds me a lot of Appalachia. We went for a walk through a section of forest that was kind of an untouched sort of section of forest, and I mean, there's life at every level. I mean, there were plants on the ground, plants hanging, vines, and then large trees, and just birds at every layer of the forest, and the whole thing seemed alive, and which is a lot like a hardwood forest in Appalachia. I mean, there's life at every level.
Very cool.
It was a really similar feeling being in the forest in both places.
What are the major challenges to the ceruleans in Colombia?
Well, a lot of the habitat there, it's deforestation again, which is the problem that ceruleans have kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
In Colombia, the deforestation is primarily due to agriculture, particularly coffee. Also cattle and some other kind of crops, but coffee, the coffee growing region in Colombia overlaps with the region where ceruleans like to spend the winter. So that's a problem if you cut down all the trees to grow coffee.
Right.
The traditional way to grow coffee in the tropics is to grow it under the shade of the canopy. So you would leave the canopy trees, grow coffee in the shade. That's good for a lot of reasons. One, you don't have to worry about erosion if you have trees and a lot of other vegetation in addition to the coffee. You don't need to use as much in the way of pesticides. You have nature's pesticides, the little birds, eating the insects. It's also, the soil is rich because of all the plant diversity. The problem, though, is that the beans have to stay on the plant for a little bit longer because they're not getting the full sun. They take a longer time to mature, which means they taste better, in my opinion.
Right. Mine too.
It's like a richer flavor, but the farmer can't turn a profit as quickly. unless we charge more for shade-grown coffee, which we do, but then people don't want to buy it if it's a little bit more expensive sometimes. So when I was in Colombia, I went to some presentations given by folks from the Colombian Coffee Growers Association, and they said they don't want to be known as the destroyers of birds, but they have to make a profit. They have to have a livelihood.
Yeah.
So they were encouraging us to go back to the U.S. and sort of tell everyone to buy shade-grown, bird-friendly coffee.
Do they have a lot of shade-grown coffee currently in Colombia that they just need a market for, or are they trying to expand it?
I think right now, there's more shade-grown coffee that comes out of Central America than South America. But there are several shade-grown coffee farms in Colombia. But it's a little bit easier to find shade-grown coffee from Central America, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, than it is South America. And of course, shade-grown coffee from Central America is still good. You're still protecting habitat for birds, but different, not the cerulean necessarily, though the cerulean might stop over in Central America on the way to South America. But Central American shade-grown coffee farms, you'd help the golden-winged warbler by buying shade-grown coffee from Central America, wood thrush, chestnut-sided warbler, and of course a lot of endemic species that would stay put in Central and South America all year.
Your discussion of shade-grown coffee was very thought-provoking. There's some types of shade-grown coffee you noted that don't really help the birds. Tell us a little about that.
Right.
Which I hadn't heard before. I mean, that was interesting.
Well, what I learned from doing some of this research is that there are a lot of certifications for coffee, and they all mean different things. Certainly certified coffee of any kind is probably better than any kind of uncertified coffee. I learned that the USDA organic label is very expensive and can be very difficult for small coffee farmers. The different kinds of shade-grown coffee in particular, though, is interesting. The Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center has a little green and white logo that's usually considered to be the strictest, they have the strictest criteria of any of the shade-grown labels. They specify what kind of trees have to be shading the coffee plants, the heights of the trees, that kind of thing. Some coffee that might call itself shade-grown, the shade might be provided by banana trees, but you're not providing the same kind of habitat. Banana trees don't really attract the neotropical migrant songbirds like the broadleaf evergreen trees that are native. Bananas can be great if you grow bananas kind of amongst the coffee. It can be a secondary source of income for the farmer, but it doesn't really provide a great habitat for songbirds. So some coffee that might call itself shade-grown but might not be certified by somebody like the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center might not be as good as it could be. Yeah.
Did you meet a lot of local ornithologists and birders in Colombia?
I did.
I'm curious what they think of us. I mean, do they say, well, why do you guys keep blowing up your mountains and killing them in the north, and then we set up these preserves, but fewer are coming back, or what are their attitudes? Because we don't hear that side of the story very often.
Well, something interesting I learned at the summit is that about 75% of the studies on neotropical migrants take place on the breeding grounds. So there haven't been a lot of studies where the birds spend the winter. That's one thing I learned I never really thought of before. I also learned that Colombia, as I'm sure you know, has a very kind of turbulent recent past.
Right.
There are several guerrilla groups in Colombia that are, very famous for kidnapping people and then holding them for, months to 8-10 years. These membership in these guerrilla organizations has decreased in the last 10 years or so due to an array of complicated factors. One consequence of the guerrilla groups' numbers decreasing has been now that biologists can go in and study parts of the country that were unsafe to travel in before.
That makes sense.
So in a lot of ways, these guerrilla groups were sort of the ultimate leave-no-trace campers.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to use the forest and landscape to hide, to evade their capture. So they did their best to leave not everywhere, but some of their camps, they left it very forested, which is good for birds. However, at least when I was researching this book a few years ago, Colombia was, I believe, third in the world in landmine fatalities. Wow. Because when these guerrilla groups pulled back from their camps, they left landmines, hoping to sort of blow up the military or the police coming in to search. Unfortunately, people besides the military and the police have been harmed by these landmines. But it really made me think, if you're a biologist studying birds in Colombia and you're going into a very remote area where no one but guerrillas have been for a while, you're literally risking your life going in to study the birds.
It would be very nerve-wracking.
Certainly.
What about the Colombian people? Did they seem to feel affinity for their native birds the way
they did?
People like you do in this country?
Well, yes. I went to when I went to the town San Vicente de Chucurí, which is right near the Cerulean Reserve. Mm-hmm. About 20 folks from the U.S. went to this town, and they were having their migratory bird festival while we were there. And at first I thought, yeah, whatever, migratory bird festival. I'm sure it'll be like a couple booths with pamphlets,
Like we do.
Like we do, right.
Exactly, this week in particular.
Yes. But no, there was a marching band. There were a marching band from the local high school. There were kids dressed up as cerulean warblers and golden wing warblers.
You have a nice picture.
I do. I took lots of pictures of those kids. I even have video of the marching band. Kids dressed up as fairies of the forest, I guess. Kids dressed up in military uniforms. Just this whole the parade kept coming with all these children, and the theme was birds. And then several of the kids had puppets, cerulean warbler puppets.
I like that.
Some of them, if they weren't dressed as cerulean warblers, some of the kids had visors with a cutout cerulean on the visor, and you could tell that they were hand colored or hand painted, and it was really great. The kids were really excited about the birds. We went birding with the kids in the town square, just a small sort of 14-acre park in the town, and the kids were pointing out birds left and right, using their scientific names.
Oh, that's amazing.
It was great. Yeah, I mean, it was fabulous. The kids were really wonderful, and they really seemed like they were excited about the birds that lived amongst them. And I started thinking, why can't, in West Virginia, why can't we have a parade of kids dressed as ceruleans?
It would be nice.
Yeah, it would be great.
I haven't seen it yet, but
soon.
Maybe someday. It's a great book. You learn a tremendous amount of natural history about the cerulean warblers. You also, it's a travel book, because you go to, like you said, West Virginia. We give a nice overview of our state, and Tennessee and Colombia. It's got a personal journey, which is always fun. It allows entry in there. Who did you see as the audience for this book? Well, something the publisher, I'm sure, made you write down at one point in the proposal process.
Well, I hope that the audience I hope it's everyone. Everyone should buy the book. I hope the audience is. I was hoping to write the book in a way that was technically accurate. I always get very mad when I read a book and someone gets the biology incorrect. Right. So I tried very hard to make sure that everything was scientifically accurate, and I had many people read it to make sure I was not misquoting or anything, So I wanted the book to be accurate, but I also wanted it to be fun. I didn't want it to be just a nonfiction book about ceruleans that wasn't entertaining to read. So I try to be funny.
It is.
Thanks. I try to include enough personal stuff so people feel like they're kind of going along on the journeys with me.
Sure.
But also technically accurate. So I was hoping that the audience could be birders, definitely. I mean, this is a favorite bird for most bird watchers I know. I mean, the cerulean is everybody's favorite. How could it not be? I also wanted the audience to be maybe people who watched birds at a bird feeder, were interested in birds, but maybe weren't as hardcore yet.
Going to Colombia.
Yes. And I hope that somebody like my mom could read the book. My mom is, she loves birds, she feeds birds, but she has never gone on a bird walk or a bird trip. But she is kind of an environmentalist. And I wanted, I thought I had her in mind. Somebody who has an interest in natural history, but maybe hasn't taken the next step yet.
What do your students think of the book?
Well, they have to tell me they like it. So.
That's true.
So, I mean, I haven't haven't had much criticism from my students, but they'll get an F-, if they don't like my book.
it
So
and write a rave review.
yes.
One last question as we wrap up. You are an educator, and this occurred to me when you were talking about Colombia and the young people over there. And I know you have a child too. And do you think there's a way to encourage young people to feel a connection to birds or any type of wildlife the way you do?
I hope so. I mean, my first word was bird.
Your mom told you that?
Yes, yeah,
Awesome.
My mom has recorded the date of when I said my first word. She used to hold me in front of the bird feeders and say, look at the birds, until I finally said bird. I think that getting kids outside, the world is amazing.
Right.
There are all kinds of amazing things in the world, from little caterpillars to little birds like the cerulean warbler, or fish, or salamanders. Some of these small amphibians are so brightly colored and so amazing that how could you not look at them and think, wow.
That's pretty cool.
But you have to get the kids out there, and let them. At least with my daughter's, 8.5 months old, and she's been very dirty so far. We don't really encourage her to eat dirt, but
Right.
it happens, I'm sure.
It does.
And she definitely has eaten some dandelions already. I think getting kids out there is great, and one way certainly to encourage kids is maybe hosting kids walks or family hikes that are easy, where you do things like turn over rocks. You wade in a stream and your feet get wet, and who cares? Your feet get wet. It's just water. Feel the mud in between your toes. Another great way to get kids interested in wildlife. The organization you mentioned that I co-founded, the Avian Conservation Center of Appalachia. One of our missions is to educate the public and do outreach programs, and we currently have 2 non-releasable birds that we take around to schools and scout groups and anybody interested really, and do educational programs and get these kids up close to live birds, which is really wonderful. The kids really love it. We have a barn owl, and it's a bird that's not often seen in West Virginia. There are some here in the Panhandle in Hardy County, but elsewhere in the state they're very rare or absent. So getting the kids up close to a barn owl like that is really amazing, and they just love it. And I've had several classes of children, send us notes with drop pictures they drew of the barn owl, and I love birds. So getting kids up close to wildlife in that kind of setting, and also getting kids up close to wildlife just out on a hike. Bugs, and they're wild too.
Okay. Is your next book going to be on birds?
Of course.
Well, you got the bird bug. That's good.
Yes, the book I'm working on right now, which is going more slowly than I would like, and I blame Laurel, my baby, for that. The next book is about vultures, so I'm kind of going from small...
The most beautiful lovebird.
Yes, yeah. I'm going from small, cute, and declining to kind of large, maybe less cute, and probably increasing.
Well, Katie, this is a wonderful book, and once again, the title is Cerulean Blues, A Personal Search for a Vanishing Songbird. I really enjoyed reading it. I read it in a night.
Oh, wow.
And not just because I'm a procrastinator. It was a week ago. And it's a great history of the Ceruleans, and you learn quite a bit about the environmental history of West Virginia, Tennessee, and Colombia in particular. Was fascinating, and I appreciate you coming out here, and I really hope you'll come back with your vulture book. We have more turkey vultures than we do ceruleans here.
Right. Most places do.
We'd like to learn more about them. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you.
And thank all of you for tuning in. Really appreciate your time, and thanks again.